Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers with me, Duncan Barkes, we're joined in the TPA studio by Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, John O'Connell. John, good to have you on the podcast again.
Thanks for having me. The sun's out, so all's good in the world.
It's a nice day in London town, and we welcome back to A Nation of Taxpayers Ted Bromund, former Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a friend of the TPA, and our American expert in many ways, Ted.
Great to be back with you, Duncan. Thank you.
And in many ways, this week, it's all about, well, you're probably old enough to remember Sesame Street.
I am indeed. I can even sing the song.
It's all about the letter T. So we're talking Trump, we're talking trade, we're talking tariffs. I'm just wondering whether or not we shouldn't have slapped a tariff on you coming into our country, Ted.
Well, I'm very glad you didn't, because I just got done with a fantastic hike along the Ridgeway, and I could not have had a more pleasant time.
So I'm sitting here with one of the front pages of our national newspapers. It's all about tariffs. It's all about Trump's announcement from last week. I mean, first off, Ted, what do you make of what he did?
I think it's important that we be sort of measured and reasonable about this, so I'll try to maintain that tone. I think this is the most foolish, senseless, and idiotic measure that he could possibly have taken. It is damaging to the U.S. economic interests. It's damaging to the interests of democratic trading partners around the world. It is almost certainly going to have terrible political consequences for the Republican Party in the United States. It is geopolitically destructive. There is no sensible argument that I can construct in favor of any of these tariff measures, except perhaps for some limited and genuinely national security measures against the People's Republic of China.
Okay, which begs the question, why has he done it?
President Trump has, since the 1980s, genuinely and sincerely believed, and I don't think he's a hypocrite in this regard, he has genuinely and sincerely believed that trade deficits are a sign of national weaknesses and trade surpluses are a sign of national strength. The U.S. has trade deficits with quite a few countries around the world. He views that as negative, and he thinks tariffs are the way to fix it. I disagree with absolutely every single part of that indictment, but that has been his sincere view since NAFTA and President Reagan in the 1980s.
John, I mean, it's been a few days since Trump made his announcement. When he outlined the various tariffs against various countries, of course, in the UK, 10% tariffs on the UK for most goods, 25% on cars that we might sell to the US. What was going through your head at the time?
Tariffs are taxes.
Yeah.
You know, as somebody who's been at the Taxpayers Alliance now for 14 years, 15 years, in fact, goodness, you know, you have to keep repeating the same old truths over and over again. And it can be dull, boring. You keep repeating them till you're blue in the face. But tariffs are taxes. And if you want less of something, you tax it. So if you want less trade, you tax it. There does seem to be this view that trade is this sort of zero-sum game that somebody loses out. But you know, when two nations trade, one might be in trade deficit, but their consumers have gained with whatever goods are being purchased at reasonable prices. So initial reaction is, oh God, you know, swinging tax increases, you know, in terms of the tariff. But if you're looking for a glimmer of hope, I mean, it was 10% only for Brexit Britain.
Well, I was going to mention the B word, Brexit. I mean, are we saying this is a Brexit benefit?
Technically, in a sense, it is. We're not tied to the EU, so therefore we don't have the same rate as our friends in the EU. So in that sense, it's a win. But if we're scrambling around looking for those kinds of wins in such bad economic news, then we're really in a bad place, I suppose. I find it interesting. And now, of course, people on Trump's team and his supporters are starting to say that there are countries sending letters to Trump saying, how do we negotiate? Yeah. You know, that's their point, I suppose.
Well, that's a really interesting
they're trying
point.
to use this as leverage.
So the front page of today's Times, and I mean the usual caveat applies with our podcast here. We record it on a Tuesday afternoon and gets published on a Thursday, so anything could happen in the next 48 hours. But the US administration saying that more than 50 countries are attempting to negotiate a reduction in the tariffs imposed on them. Trump suggested that those countries would not have done so, quote, if I didn't do what I did over the last couple of weeks. So is it starting to work, Ted?
It's probably true. There will be some negotiations and there probably will be some reductions in tariffs. But the administration is saying all sorts of things out of several sides of its mouth simultaneously on this. On the one hand, it's talking about possible negotiations. On the other hand, lots of sources of the administration are saying that the point of this is to reduce the trade deficit, and the tariffs are going to stay on at least some countries for the foreseeable future. So I don't see how you get to a net positive out of this, even if you make some really charitable assumptions about future negotiations. Those are going to take years to play out. Whereas the pain to economies around the world, not least the United States, but also certainly the United Kingdom, is going to be immediate and serious.
And if I just put my sort of beginner's foreign policy hat on, if America's looking to the Asian theatre as the next sort of big area of focus, then presumably we're going to, or America and its friends in the West, if they still are friends, are going to need other friends around the world, and hitting countries that we might wish to strike up better relationships with in this sort of multipolar world. It doesn't seem to make too much sense in that regard.
It's very striking that post-1945, the U.S. was the big driver of freer trade around the world. Sometimes, I have to point out, with some slight resistance from the United Kingdom. But in its big alliance building, Cold War, anti-Soviet heyday, the U.S. viewed free trade as a geopolitical weapon to help bring countries on side with it. And I really cannot construct an argument whereby tariffs and opposing free trade are going to encourage countries to side with the U.S. or the West generally against the PRC, never mind Russia and other sundry bad actors.
You've got your finger on the pulse of US politics. John, rightly, you made the point there that there are donors and backers of Trump who are going, whoa, hang on a second, fella, this is too much, too quickly. Why are you doing this? But we know that Trump is not the kind of man to change his mind now or do a U-turn. So where does that leave him politically in the US if his supporters and donors are just going, you shouldn't be doing this?
Right now, his position is still pretty strong. The U.S. economy, it's been less than a week. The U.S. economy has not suffered anything immediate and dreadful. The stock market has taken a nasty tumble. Virtually no one likes that. I certainly don't. But until real pain starts to be felt at the state and the local level, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a significant political pushback in the U.S. There's already a bill in the Senate which has 7 Republican co-sponsors to limit the president's ability to change tariffs. But if that goes through the House, and I've been told that it won't go through the House, at least not in the near future, the president will simply veto it, and there's no way that Congress will have enough votes to override. So I don't discount the possibility of a reversal at some point, but I can't predict when it's going to be. It's not going to be soon.
Yeah, no. It's, the political ramifications are very interesting, and we were talking ahead of this, just sort of chit-chatting, and this idea that Trump's come in very bombastically, he's trying to do a hell of a lot straight away, and kind of analogies elsewhere in the world, Ted.
Yeah, I was making the point before we started this that in some ways President Trump reminds me of former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Both of them came in, both of them wanted to do a heck of a lot very rapidly, and as a result of trying to do a heck of a lot very rapidly in a relatively uncoordinated kind of way, they stirred up an enormous amount of opposition. which ended up being extremely bad, both for their own parties and for the broader future of the free market conservative movements in both the US and the UK. The difference is that I agreed with a lot of the things that former Prime Minister Truss wanted to do, although I think the way they were undertaken was perhaps not the best. Whereas I don't agree with a great many of the economic things that President Trump is trying to do.
You mentioned China earlier. I mean, we're recording this and we know that China have responded with a 34% increase in terms of the tariffs placed on American goods coming into China. How much of this is about China, Ted?
A fair amount of it is about China because the U.S. has a big trade deficit with China. But I think it's a mistake to reduce this to being primarily about China. I think this is about President Trump's vision of a U.S. which has an overall and even perhaps a country by country balanced trade, and the view that reciprocal, so-called tariffs, are the way to get there. I mean, take this as an example. If we were really serious about trying to reduce foreign tariffs, you could construct an argument for raising U.S. tariffs by the measure that other countries tariff U.S. goods.
Yeah.
I wouldn't personally agree with that, but you could construct a decent negotiating argument out of that. But that's not what we've done. We've raised U.S. tariffs in proportion to the extent that we have a trade deficit with other countries. That's a completely different way of going about things, and it strongly suggests to me that the point of this is the trade deficits. It's not other countries' tariffs.
What would be the economic thread to that, right? Because is it as simple as, Donald Trump doesn't like the fact that he loses. He wants to win all the time. So is a trade deficit therefore, akin to losing? Or is there a genuine economic thread to this? Because, you talked about he's had this view over a certain number of decades. I don't have that same perspective. I was wondering if there is an economic thread to this.
Well, yeah, there's an economic view to this. It happens to be wrong, but there is an economic view to this. The view is that a trade deficit means that we're losing money as opposed to a trade surplus, meaning that we're making money. That is so illiterate that it almost passes my ability to rebut it. The common rebuttal is, I have a massive trade deficit with my local grocery store. Yeah. All I do is give them money, and in return, I get food. Well, they're obviously winning this exchange. Yeah. That would the UK as a whole be better off if London tariffed against Birmingham? Would I be better off if I tariffed against my trade with other individuals? It is a completely illiterate and reductive argument, but it is seductive in its simplicity, and lots of people believe it.
Right, and the idea that this is about American manufacturing jobs, and none of this really takes into account trade deficit or surplus in services.
No, it's all about manufactured goods. And as a matter of fact, I looked at this just this morning. The U.S. manufacturing sector has never produced more goods than it did last year. We did that with fewer people. That is a good thing, right? It is a tremendous compliment to American industry and to American workers that we produce more with less. Instead of focusing on manufacturing goods, why don't we try to drive everyone back to be farmers, right? We could let's go back beyond manufacturing. Let's go back to the point where 90% of the population worked brutally hard jobs tilling the land to raise food. We could apply tariffs until we achieve that objective. Would that be a sensible thing in terms of our national well-being, either personally or financially? Yeah. Absolutely not. The future of economies overall, everywhere, is in services. Driving employment back to manufacturing is no more sensible than trying to drive it back to farming or driving it back to banging one rock against another rock.
Let's just move it away for a second from the politics and the economics of it, because I'm fascinated continually about Trump as a personality and as a character. And many years ago, probably about 11, 12 years ago, I read his book, The Art of the Deal. Now, there's some debate about how much of it he actually wrote. If you go online, there's a writer, a journalist saying, well, basically, it was mostly me. Though, of course, Trump says, no, that's not the case. I wrote the book or whatever. And there's an essence in that book, which is all about when you're trying to get a deal, you go in hard. Tell me if you think this is a fair assessment, Ted. You go in hard. I'm paraphrasing. You go in hard. You really stomp your feet to begin with. Then you just ease back a little bit, and ultimately, it's seen as being a bit more pragmatic and compromised, and you get what you want. Is a bit of that going on here when we saw this display where he, revealed on worldwide television, where it was almost like, this big flip chart with all of the tariffs he's going to put on, against each country, this showmanship or whatever. Is there a bit of that approach going on here?
Yeah, probably there is to a certain extent. I do think that there's very likely to be a US-UK deal of some sort, but US-UK trade is basically balanced. If you view that as a good thing, I don't particularly, but I think President Trump does. So, yeah, you're likely to see some deals here and there, but the U.S. doesn't have the bureaucratic manpower to deal with 180 countries around the world. Even if that was the goal, we don't have the ability to conduct 180 negotiations simultaneously. And yeah, he's always been a hard bargainer, and there's some logic in that, absolutely. But he's always also been an anti-trade deficit kind of person, and that's at least as consistent a view of his as being a hard bargainer.
What do you think, John? What's your take on how he's gone about doing this?
It's really interesting, right? Because if you compare it to J.D. Vance when he went over to the Munich Security Conference and basically gave Europe a kick up the backside, and the response was...
Tears.
Damn, but there were tears, and damn, we've got to spend more money on defence. And there was a sort of feeling coming out of that finally Europe got that kind of hard medicine that it needed to realise where things are when it comes to defence spending and the broader security issues around the world. It feels like the same sort of thread of argument here. Hit them hard, hit them tough, and they'll come begging, and they'll sort themselves out. And as you alluded to, the American administration is already saying that we're getting letters in from all these countries and whatnot. But, the implications for this are quite profound. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be boring. Tariffs are taxes. So when we start to impose that on a thing that's been so demonstrably successful as free trade, it starts to have quite serious implications, not just for the countries on which these tariffs have been imposed, but American consumers too.
Yeah, I would just slightly amend John's comment about tariffs being taxes. Tariffs are taxes on the domestic consumer. So often in this discussion, the argument is made, it's the foreigner who pays. No, it is the American or other consumers who pay these tariffs, these taxes. The level of economic literacy here is very high.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, it's not just about the countries on which these tariffs have been imposed. It's the American consumers who have benefited for decades from this system. So I think the implications are quite profound, and that sort of same tactic of telling the world, telling Europe to sort yourselves out. It seems to be that sort of same playbook, but with much more profound consequences.
Ted, you mentioned a free trade agreement earlier. I want to return to that before we end this particular episode. But I'm fascinated and I want people's views on this, about where you think Keir Starmer is in all of this, our Prime Minister, and how he's played it so far. So we know the EU have responded by saying, well, we're going to ratchet things up in response. We know what China are doing. Starmer has kind of, and he's had praise actually from rival politicians. He's not knee-jerk to this. He's kind of taken a step back and is being, some might say, cool, calm about it all. Ted, starting off with you, what's your assessment on how Starmer's played this so far?
I think he's played it very well. Honestly, he had a good meeting with President Trump in their first get-together in the White House. Other of President Trump's get-togethers with foreign leaders have not always gone so well. From the domestic UK point of view, although it is or it would be jolly satisfying to retaliate, and I can't say that the U.S. wouldn't deserve it. It would be a measure of economic self-harm for the UK to impose tariffs. It would feel really good, but would end up hurting the UK consumers. Yeah. So I think the UK is really well placed to get a trade deal with the US. That is the one consolation I take out of this disastrous and foolhardy policy. But from the UK point of view, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay. Yeah, on Starmer, I'd say yes, but I think he's done reasonably well, actually. And staying cool, not reacting and these are all great things. So I think he's actually played a very good game over the last few weeks. Well, having said that, I think that in order for this country, away from the European Union, to get itself ready for the upcoming challenges in the world, there are very, very basic things that it needs to turn its own attention to domestically. So that's the tax system. Yeah. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's the tax system, it's regulation, it's infrastructure. It's all of these things that we constantly carp on about in the domestic economic sphere. You know, if we actually turned our attention to some of that stuff and got it done, we would be in a much stronger place going into what we're about to go into over the next few decades. And you kind of hope,
wouldn't you, that the current government might think, by looking at what Trump has done, we have an opportunity here to actually do things differently for the sake of the country going forward, to try and get further growth, and for the sake of British business.
Absolutely. I do think that, you know, getting those basics right will matter more than ever, and they're right in and of themselves. You know, we need to give businesses the room to grow, to expand, not direct everything from Whitehall. All of that good stuff that the TPA and others keep banging on about. But in this context, it's even more important, Duncan.
So important.
Yeah, I've really been struck by the hypocrisy of a lot of folks about the free trade issue over the last several months and even years. You take a look at U.S. polling now, and it's remarkable. Free trade has the support of about 75% of the U.S. public, and only 12% is opposed. That's a reaction to Trump phenomena. All the Democrats have all of a sudden decided that they're in favor of free trade because Trump's opposed to it. Yeah. But the argument for free trade is the argument for economic freedom, limited government, and low taxation writ large. It is the same argument. Taxing money away in the domestic space to pass it on to government workers, holders of UK debt obligations, and receivers of UK entitlements is just as economically destructive, because it is the same thing as putting a tax on imports. Now, I'm not denying that you have to have some level of domestic spending, but it should be as low as possible. And anyone who is in favor of free trade, but also is in favor of a gigantic tax and spend state, is at least as economically incoherent as President Trump is.
And just because we've got the honour of having you here, I'm going to ask a question instead of throwing my own comment out there, Ted. But, you know, Trump's rise to power has been very much about the left behind towns in the Rust Belt of America and all of this kind of thing. So the loss of manufacturing jobs and nothing to replace them. Lots of people feeling left behind by globalization and all of this kind of stuff. Is there a sense that, okay, I don't think personally that these measures with tariffs will restore the greatness of these particular towns, you know, in the sense that they will have their manufacturing back tomorrow, right? But what does the Republican response need to be to the needs of those people?
I think there's a tremendous difficulty in trying to address a lot of these things through strictly economic measures. There definitely are economic policies that I would like to see advanced. The states that are struggling, or the areas that are struggling, frequently tend to be areas with higher levels of taxation, controls on building of houses, which makes housing expensive, which makes it difficult for workers to move there. So there are definitely economic factors that need to be fixed. But this is also a cultural and an educational problem. It is natural and inevitable that productive capacity in various ways moves around a country and around the world. The thing to do is to be a society and a country that can adapt to that. And that means education. That means things that the TPA is not immediately concerned with, like stable family structures. It means a society that takes individual responsibility for dealing with change seriously. And it means, to quote one of my heroes from the UK, a little bit of get on your bike, a little bit of willingness to move around. U.S. mobility has decreased markedly over the last 20 years as people feel, thanks in part to welfare measures and others, that they don't really need to move around to take new jobs. This is a hugely complicated mix of economic, social, and cultural factors all combined together.
Yeah, we've got a very strong wish and desire for the rebuilding of the family structure at the TPA, come to think of it, not least because the tax system in the UK is extremely individualised, much more so than other countries. We don't look at family units in the tax system barely at all. And also the extent to which a strong family needs less from the state, it reduces welfare bills, better education, all of these kinds of things. So I think you're right. But then also some of the stuff that you talked about as a remedy to the left behind places in America, maybe you're just look at Florida, look at Texas, get your basics right and things will happen.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. was built in substantial part by people moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. Yeah. The idea that you should move to areas of economic opportunity is neither new or, I would argue, inhumane. What is inhumane and wrong for the more productive parts of the country is to try to fix a city, a state, a region in amber in perpetuity and subsidize it so that it never has to change. That's something that no country, not the UK, not the US, not anywhere else, can afford over the long haul. And I would argue that it is morally wrong. I think people have an obligation to work if they are physically and mentally able to do so. Yeah. And my standards of being physically and mentally able to do so are pretty low. The UK has an enormous problem with paying what we all know are basically fit people to not work. The U.S. has a not quite as large problem, but a fairly similar problem. Sure. I think it is morally wrong not to contribute to your own self-improvement, your family, and society if you are capable of doing so. And that goes far beyond an economic question.
You wouldn't get any argument from me, and I don't think from John either. No. Just very quickly, because we've only got a few minutes left, I want to return to this idea of a free trade agreement. And I know you talk to a lot of people across the political spectrum in the US, Ted. Well, I suppose two questions. First off, how likely do you think it is we're going to get a free trade agreement with the US inside or by the end of this year, 2025? And secondly, what's the kind of view, if you like, in the US, the view from those that matter about the UK at the moment?
I think the odds of an agreement are pretty high. You mentioned, and I agree with you entirely before we started this, Duncan, that when President Trump makes his visit to the UK this coming summer would be an opportune moment to unveil something. I think
that's my hunch.
I think that's a very, very savvy read. I've been really struck talking to Republican and Democratic offices on the Hill in Congress over the last couple of weeks about how many offices really want a US-UK deal. And, you get some offices that want it for particular state-based reasons. They've got big aerospace industries, et cetera. But a lot of them, when you ask why, they give you very standard geopolitical reasons. Overwhelmingly, offices say, well, it's the UK, isn't it? Of course we have to do a deal with them. They're our best friends.
But is that still based on the idea that there is some kind of special relationship?
Yeah, Americans don't have the qualms about saying special relationship that are so... I mean, I know that in the UK, people will cringe or they won't say it or they'll say it ironically. But Americans say it and they are not uncomplicated or ironic about it. They really like the UK.
I mean, I wasn't saying it sarcastically, but I think you can make the argument that if you have your faith in the special relationship with the UK and US, you can make the argument inside the last couple of weeks, and you can roll Ukraine into that as well, which we won't get onto in much detail. But you can argue that relationship has been slightly dented, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. But I always take the point of view that the US-UK relationship is like an iceberg. Most of it is below the water. Yeah. And all the political stuff is the 10% above the water. No, I'm not saying that can't be very damaging, because the 10% is the stuff that catches the wind and pushes the rest of the iceberg wherever it's going. But the relationship has a lot of stability because of that 90% below the water. Yeah. That in no way is an endorsement of what's happened over the last week, but it does make me a bit more measured about that.
I just think on the special relationship, the countries like the UK, Western Europe, have become too dependent on the idea that the US will always be there. Yeah. Right, and I mentioned J.D. Vance's speech to the Munich Security Conference earlier. That was a good wake-up call. Yeah. For us to get our own house in order, spend more on defence. Yeah. Didn't it work? Keir Starmer took money out of the aid budget, put it into defence. Keir Starmer also played another blinder by getting Trump over for an official state visit. So having that corrective, I think, will bolster the relationship rather than impact it negatively. I think it's a good thing for the relationship longer term.
And from a TPA perspective, some form of free trade agreement. What I mean, let's just do. I hate the term blue sky thinking, but from a TPA perspective, what would we like to see in some kind of agreement going forward with the US?
Well, I suppose, yeah. What's in our interest? The automotive industry seems to be high up the list, doesn't it? Farming products. I've heard lots about specialty farming products like lamb, as with trade, it's sort of leaning into what you're good at doing, rather than having to reverse engineer something you're not so good at. So, stuff like that would be high up the list. But again, the idea of a free trade agreement, I share Ted's lukewarm positivity towards the chances of it happening.
Yeah, I mean, my goal for an FTA is very simple: zero tariffs, zero quotas, complete free trade with the U.S. and the U.K.
Hurrah!
So I can do that. I can do that very, very simply. Yeah. From the U.S. point of view, it's always going to come down to agriculture, and I'm just sick up to the back of my gullet with the U.K.'s historically very weird now desire to not have free trade in food. Where have Cobden and Bright gone to? Where is the Anti-Corn Law League when you really need it? But I've been really struck in talking to U.S. congressional offices about how imaginative they're willing to be. One office said, look, the UK should just do a deal to buy sustainable, i.e. U.S. grain-based aviation fuels from the U.S. as a bulk purchase deal, and we can sell that as agriculture to the farmers, and then you won't have to eat our lovely food, and we'll both be happy about it. Now, I would prefer just complete free trade, but if that's the way you include agriculture and make the U.S. happy without forcing the U.K. to eat all of our lovely beef, fantastic. I can live with that.
Listen, it's been a really fascinating chat. John, thank you for being part of the podcast this week.
No, good to see you again, Duncan.
And Ted, thank you as always.
Duncan, great to see you.
How long are you left? How long have we got you here for in the UK before you go back?
About another week, Excellent. By which time I expect US trade policy will have changed again.
Well, you just outlined a perfectly sensible approach as far as I'm concerned. Ted, great to see you again. Thank you for guesting on this particular episode. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Love getting your emails. And just a reminder, you can find this podcast, A Nation of Taxpayers, from the Taxpayers Alliance. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. If you like what we do, please like us on those platforms, follow us on those platforms, and in the case of YouTube, you can subscribe as well. Until next time, thank you for listening.